Most Americans believe Donald Trump deported more undocumented immigrants than any president in modern history. And that belief is wrong. Barack Obama, the president many remember as more compassionate on immigration, deported far more people than Donald Trump did during his first term. Roughly 3 million deportations under Obama, closer to about 1 million to 1.2 million under Trump. So why does the public memory feel completely reversed? Well, it's because immigration politics in America stopped being about numbers. It became about fear. It became about tone. And it became about a style of rhetoric that deliberately tapped into racial anxiety about a country that is rapidly changing. See, Donald Trump didn't just talk about immigration policy. He spoke about demographic change itself as a threat. His language was as sharp, acerbic, and intentionally confrontational. Immigrants weren't framed as workers or families. They were framed as invaders, as criminals, as proof that America was losing control of its cultural identity. That framing wasn't accidental. It was political strategy. Because when people feel that the country is slipping away from them, they don't just vote on policy. They vote on emotion. Now contrast that with Barack Obama. Obama's administration enforced immigration law very aggressively, often more aggressively than many of his own supporters expected. At one point, immigration advocates gave him a nickname, the deporter-in-chief. That label didn't come from conservatives. It came from activists frustrated by the scale of enforcement. And yet Obama's rhetoric emphasized inclusion. He talked about immigrants as part of the American story. He spoke about reform and dignity and belonging, even while deportation numbers were reaching historic highs. And Trump chose a different path, not just stricter language, but a narrative that portrayed demographic change as loss. When a president repeatedly frames immigration as a cultural invasion, it doesn't just change policy debates. It reshapes how millions of Americans interpret reality. Demographic shifts stop looking like evolution. They start feeling like displacement. And here's the paradox. Despite the harsh rhetoric, Trump's deportation totals never reached Obama-era levels. The spectacle of enforcement grew louder. The imagery became more dramatic, but the raw numbers, they were lower, which raises a deeper question. Was the objective enforcement, or was the objective performance? Because performance politics thrives on this conflict. It thrives on sharp language. It thrives on defining an us and a them. And immigration, especially in a country undergoing rapid Latino population growth, became the perfect stage for that kind of politics. This is where demographic change enters the story. The United States is in the middle of one of the largest cultural transformations in its history. Younger generations are far more diverse. Spanish is more present in public life. Latino voters are reshaping political coalitions state by state. And for some Americans, that change feels like progress, but for others, it feels like loss. And Trump's rhetoric leaned heavily into that second emotion. Leadership always involves choices. Leaders can lower the temperature, or they can raise it. They can speak to fear, or they can speak to possibility. Trump chose a style that amplified anxiety about who belongs in America. Not quietly, not subtly, but constantly. And that constant framing transformed immigration from a policy question into an identity struggle. And that shift has consequences. Because once an issue becomes about identity, compromise becomes almost impossible. Statistics, evidence lose their power, facts become secondary to feeling, and politics becomes a battle over belonging itself. See, for Latino communities, the difference between Obama and Trump wasn't just about deportation totals. It was about dignity. Under Obama, enforcement was real, sometimes painfully so. But the broader narrative still suggested inclusion. Under Trump, even when enforcement numbers were lower, the rhetoric often felt harsher, more personal, more racialized, and that emotional difference shaped how many Latino voters experienced American politics during that era. There's a historical pattern here. Periods of rapid demographic change often produce leaders who speak in sharper, more divisive tones. We saw it during earlier waves of immigration. We saw it during the civil rights movement. And we're seeing it again now. The question isn't whether demographic change creates anxiety. It always has. The real question is how our leaders respond to that anxiety. Do they calm it or do they amplify it? Trump chose amplification. He turned immigration into a cultural battlefield. And in doing so, he reshaped the political memory of an entire era. Because people rarely remember spreadsheets. They remember stories and how you made them feel. They remember how a leader made them feel about their place in the country. And that's why the myth persists. The president with the harshest tone becomes remembered as the toughest enforcer, even when the numbers say otherwise. Narrative overtakes data, emotion overtakes statistics, and perception becomes political reality. So if you want to understand where American politics is heading, especially Latino politics, you have to understand this divide. Policy outcomes matter, but tone matters just as much. Because voters aren't just responding to enforcement, they're responding to whether they feel respected, targeted, included, or pushed aside by the national conversation. So the real lesson here isn't simply about Obama or Trump. It's about how rhetoric can redefine an issue, how language can turn immigration from governance into grievance, how a nation grappling with demographic change can be pulled towards fear or towards possibility, depending on who holds the microphone. And here's the part that needs to make all of us pause. If perception can override numbers, if tone can outweigh reality, then the future of American politics won't be decided by who has the strongest policy. It will be decided by who tells the most powerful story about who belongs. Because once immigration becomes a symbol of racial fear, the debate stops being about borders and it becomes about identity. And once politics becomes a fight over identity, it stops becoming temporary. It becomes generational. The numbers tell one story, the rhetoric tells another. And the future of American politics will be shaped by whose of those stories Americans choose to believe.